In the year 1947, a shepherd boy named Mohammed ed-Dib was herding goats through the Judean desert when he discovered a series of clay jars hidden within the caves of Qumran, approximately 10 kilometers north of the Dead Sea's northwestern shore. What he found inside those vessels would eventually reshape how scholars understood the ancient texts, though for decades the full implications of the discovery remained fragmentary, contested, and subject to institutional delays that would stretch across generations. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls, and among them lay fragments of a text that would cause considerable consternation among those who studied ancient Mesopotamian genealogies and their relationship to prehistoric timekeeping. The jars themselves had been composed in a style suggesting manufacture during the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, yet the texts they contained preserved far older materials, some pointing back to oral traditions originating in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. Scholars affiliated with the École biblique et archéologique française de Jerusalem would eventually gain custody of these materials, though access to the complete corpus would remain restricted until 1991, more than 40 years after the initial discovery. During those decades of restricted access, a parallel phenomenon was occurring in academic circles across Europe and North America, one that involved the systematic re-examination of cuneiform tablets from the Sumerian civilization. Between 1930 and 1960, archaeologists working in what had been colonial Iraq, then briefly independent, then subjected to successive geopolitical upheavals, were encountering references to astronomical observations that appeared to demand interpretive frameworks far exceeding what conventional Mesopotamian scholarship had previously acknowledged. Specifically, tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, assembled during the 7th century before the Common Era, but containing copies of texts dating back to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, contained numerical sequences that seemed to encode observations of celestial phenomena spanning periods of time so vast that they appeared to exceed the reasonable lifespan of any human observer or even any succession of mortal observers. Zacharias Sitchin, born in 1920 in Baku in what was then the Russian Empire, would later become the figure most associated with interpreting these sequences as references to a celestial visitation by beings from beyond Earth's orbit. The specific claim that Sitchin would develop and promote through a series of books beginning with The 12th Planet, published in 1976, rested upon a particular reading of Sumerian mythology as preserved in cuneiform tablets and as described in ancient texts such as the Babylonian Enuma Elish. This mythology spoke of entities designated as the Anunnaki, a term derived from the Sumerian language meaning those who came from heaven to earth. Sitchin proposed that these beings were not mythological inventions, but rather historical records, albeit encoded in symbolic language, of an actual extraterrestrial civilization that had visited Earth during prehistoric times. Furthermore, he argued that this civilization possessed advanced astronomical knowledge and sophisticated technology that allowed them to manipulate terrestrial life, establish mining operations on Earth, create artificial beings through genetic modification, and maintain detailed records of human population movements and activities through what he termed censuses. Fundamental to this interpretation was Sitchin's reconstruction of Sumerian cosmology, which he claimed described a solar system containing not 8 planets, but 12 celestial bodies, with one such body, which he called Nibiru, or the 12th planet, occupied by the Anunnaki, and possessing an extraordinarily elongated elliptical orbit, requiring approximately 3,600 years for complete revolution around the Sun. When one examines the actual cuneiform tablets that form the basis of Sitchin's interpretations,
the original texts themselves present challenges that require considerable expertise in ancient languages to navigate. The tablets in question, many of which are housed in the British Museum in London, the Vorder Asiatisches Museum in Berlin, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, employ a writing system that uses wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay with a stylus, a technology that emerged approximately 5,300 years before the Common Era in southern Mesopotamia. Translation of these tablets requires not merely linguistic competence, but familiarity with the historical context in which particular words were employed, the symbolic conventions of Sumerian religious literature, the poetic devices that ancient scribes used to convey ideas, and the phonetic values assigned to particular wedge combinations across different periods. Zecharia Sitchin, despite his claims of expertise in ancient languages, was actually a journalist and author whose formal training in Sumerian, Akkadian, or even classical languages remained limited, a fact that scholarly specialists in ancient Near Eastern studies would repeatedly emphasize in their critiques of his work. His interpretations of specific cuneiform passages would frequently be challenged by individuals with far more extensive training in decipherment, such as Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University or Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania, scholars who spent decades working directly with clay tablets and developing sophisticated understanding of Sumerian grammatical structures and semantic fields. The genealogical records that Sitchin identified as evidence of Anunnaki census-taking appear in various forms across Mesopotamian literature, most prominently in what scholars call the Sumerian king list. This document exists in multiple versions, preserved on clay tablets dating from the late Ur III period through the Old Babylonian period, approximately 2112 to 1700 before the Common Era. Tablets containing versions of the king list have been discovered at sites including Nippur, Lagash, Uruk, and Kish, often showing variations in the sequence of rulers, the lengths of their reigns, and the cities over which they held dominion. Sitchin's interpretation of this list proposed that the extraordinarily long reigns attributed to early kings, some reaching figures such as 43,000 years or 128,000 years, were not poetic exaggerations or misunderstandings, but actual chronological records of rulers who possessed lifespans extending far beyond normal human limits, a longevity that he attributed to genetic inheritance from the Anunnaki, or perhaps to advanced medical technologies they had transmitted. Yet conventional Mesopotamian scholarship offered alternative explanations, suggesting that the numerical system employed in the king list utilized a particular counting convention known as the sexagesimal system, in which base 60 rather than base 10 determined numerical representation, and that additional interpretive layers involved understanding how ancient scribes conceptualized historical time, often compressing or expanding chronological intervals according to religious or political principles, rather than attempting purely factual representation. Approximately 800 kilometers north of the Persian Gulf, in what is now southern Iraq, lies the ancient site of Uruk, one of the most significant urban centers of early human civilization. Archaeological excavations conducted between 1912 and 1914 by German scholars led by Robert Koldewey
and subsequently continued by other teams, including British and American researchers, revealed that Uruk had achieved a population of approximately 100,000 individuals at the height of its influence, during what scholars term the Uruk period, roughly between 3,500 and 3,100 before the Common Era. This represented one of the first genuine metropolitan settlements in human history, surpassing anything previously known from earlier periods.
The administrative complexity required to govern such a population necessitated the development of sophisticated record-keeping systems, and indeed, the earliest known examples of writing, dating to approximately 3,200 before the Common Era, emerged from Uruk during this period. These were not yet phonetic representations of language, but rather pictographic and ideographic symbols used primarily for accounting and inventory purposes. Various clay tablets from Uruk preserve what appear to be census records, lists of individuals associated with particular professions or households, livestock counts, grain measurements, and labor distributions. When Sitchin examined such materials, he interpreted them not as administrative documents created by Sumerian rulers managing their own territories, but as records compiled by extraterrestrial visitors engaged in systematic monitoring and control of human populations as part of a grand genetic engineering project. Within the museum collections at the Louvre in Paris and the British Museum in London are housed approximately 5,000 cuneiform tablets originating from the Old Babylonian period, a span encompassing roughly 2,000 to 1,800 before the Common Era. Among these tablets are documents that scholars classify as underscore underscore quote underscore quote underscore 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 preserving mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, and what appear to be census and population records. One particularly intriguing tablet, designated as BM 85432 in the British Museum catalogue, and studied extensively by scholars including Irving Finkel and Andrew George, contains what appears to be a detailed list of administrative divisions within a kingdom or territory, along with numerical notations suggesting population counts or resource allocations. Modern scholars working with such tablets employ methodologies that involve not merely translating the cuneiform symbols, but carefully considering the archaeological context in which tablets were discovered, the material composition of the clay, microscopic examination of the stylus impressions, comparative analysis with other tablets from the same administrative archive, and cross-referencing with contemporary administrative structures known from other sources. When such rigorous methodologies are applied to the texts that Sitchin cited, the interpretations that emerge frequently diverge substantially from his proposals. The concept of celestial beings conducting surveys and censuses of earthly populations appears in religious texts from multiple ancient cultures,
not merely Mesopotamian traditions. The Hebrew Bible, preserved in manuscripts including the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran, contains references to celestial watchers or observers, figures designated by the Aramaic term, quote, "for," who were understood to observe and report on human affairs. 2 Samuel chapter 24 describes King David ordering a census of the people of Israel and Judah, an act that the text indicates incurred divine displeasure, suggesting that in ancient Israelite traditions, population enumeration itself carried religious or cosmic significance beyond mere administrative purpose. Egyptian papyri from the New Kingdom period, dating between 1600 and 1070 before the Common Era, similarly preserve records of census activities, though these are consistently interpreted by Egyptologists as administrative exercises conducted by pharaonic authorities rather than extraterrestrial visitors. A famous census conducted during the reign of Ramses II, approximately 1280 before the Common Era, involved the counting of military-age males across Egypt's territories, and records of this enumeration appear in temple reliefs and administrative papyri currently housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and in the Luxor Temple in southern Egypt. Between 1960 and 1970, a series of scholarly conferences were organized by the American Oriental Society and the Society of Biblical Literature to discuss new interpretations of ancient Mesopotamian cosmology and astronomy. These conferences, held primarily at university venues including Harvard Divinity School and Yale University's Near Eastern Studies program, included participation from scholars such as Dietz Otto Edzard, renowned for his work on Sumerian grammar and mythology, and Juan Luis Cianciarulo, who conducted pioneering research on the mathematical astronomy preserved in Babylonian tablets. At these gatherings, the emerging interpretations that Sitchin would soon popularize in his published books were already being discussed and critiqued. Dr. Edzard presented a detailed analysis of the Anunnaki and Sumerian religious contexts, demonstrating through careful philological work that the term originally referred to a collective of divine beings understood to inhabit the underworld or lower cosmic regions, and that their relationship to human affairs in Sumerian theology involved a hierarchical divine bureaucracy rather than direct extraterrestrial visitation and genetic manipulation. Furthermore, Edzard demonstrated that the Sumerian account of human creation, as preserved in the Atrahasis Enuma, described the creation of humanity through the agency of the goddess Ninhursag and the god Enki, as a solution to a crisis in which the lower-ranking gods had become exhausted from laboring to construct irrigation canals and maintain civilization, not as part of a grand genetic engineering project conducted by beings from another planetary system. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on cuneiform tablets from the Old Babylonian period, discovered at Nippur, tells a narrative arc beginning with the creation of humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain deity, continuing through successive episodes of human population increase, and culminating in a catastrophic flood that depopulates the Earth, followed by a reconstruction of human civilization under altered conditions. Scholars have long recognized parallels between this narrative and the flood account preserved in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Genesis, as well as similarities to flood mythology from other ancient cultures, including Sumerian sources such as the Sumerian king list narrative of the flood of Utnapishtim. Sitchin interpreted the Atrahasis narrative as a historical account of Anunnaki intervention in human affairs, suggesting that the repeated cycles of human population increase and divinely mandated depopulation represented attempts by extraterrestrial beings to regulate the human population to serve particular purposes. Yet Assyriologist scholars analyzing the same texts have emphasized that the narrative structure of Atrahasis follows patterns consistent with Mesopotamian mythological thinking, in which the interactions between human and divine realms were conceptualized through narrative episodes that dramatized theological principles rather than historical events, and that the flood story itself likely derived from folk memories of actual destructive flooding events that occurred periodically in the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, events that would have profoundly impressed themselves upon Mesopotamian consciousness and inspired elaborate mythological elaboration. Particularly relevant to Sitchin's census hypothesis is his reading of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth preserved on 7 cuneiform tablets discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. This epic, composed during the Old Babylonian period but reaching its final form in Kassite Babylon around 1500 before the Common Era, describes the emergence of various divine powers through successive generations, the rise to preeminence of the god Marduk as chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, and the subsequent creation of humanity as servants to perform labor on behalf of the gods. Sitchin identified references in this text to astronomical observations and proposed that certain numerical sequences encoded information about planetary positions and celestial mechanics. However, scholars specializing in Babylonian astronomy, such as David Brown of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, have demonstrated that while the Babylonians did indeed develop sophisticated methods of tracking and predicting celestial movements, particularly the motions of the moon and planets, the specific numerical sequences that Sitchin interpreted as references to planetary orbital mechanics more accurately reflect mathematical conventions employed in Babylonian administrative accounting and liturgical calculations, rather than astronomical data. A comprehensive re-examination of Sitchin's astronomical claims was undertaken in the 1990s by various scholarly bodies, including a research group at the Jodrell Bank Observatory near Manchester in England, where astronomers led by Sir Richard Southwood utilized digital computational methods to model the orbital mechanics that Sitchin proposed. Their findings, published in peer-reviewed astronomical journals, including the Astrophysical Journal and Astronomy and Astrophysics, indicated that the orbital parameters Sitchin attributed to a supposed 12th planet, or Nibiru, were gravitationally inconsistent with observations of the solar system's structure and behavior. Specifically, an object orbiting with the characteristics Sitchin proposed would create perturbations in the orbits of the known planets, particularly Neptune and Uranus, that would be readily detectable through modern astronomical instrumentation and that had not been observed. Moreover, if such an object existed and followed the orbital path Sitchin described, it would necessarily have passed through the inner solar system during the 20th century or would do so within the 21st century, an event that would produce dramatic gravitational effects on Earth and the other terrestrial planets that would manifest as measurable changes in planetary positions and velocities, changes that had not occurred. Yet despite scientific refutation of the astronomical components of the Anunnaki hypothesis, the interpretation continued to gain adherence among certain segments of the public and among individuals engaged in what became known as Quote 6 or Quote 7. Between 1980 and 1995, numerous books were published by authors who elaborated upon Sitchin's foundational claims, often adding additional layers of speculative interpretation while exhibiting diminishing rigor in their engagement with primary sources. These works frequently invoked the census concept as evidence that extraterrestrial beings had maintained systematic control over human populations, and they cited vague references to ancient texts without providing precise citations or transliterations that would allow verification. The publication in 1995 of a book titled Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock marked a shift in the popularization of these ideas, as Hancock combined Sitchin's Anunnaki hypothesis with claims about a global prehistoric civilization that supposedly predated known human civilizations and possessed advanced technological capabilities.
Hancock's book achieved significant commercial success, selling millions of copies worldwide, though it received nearly universal condemnation from professional archaeologists and historians for its disregard of established chronologies and its reliance on speculative interpretations of both textual sources and archaeological evidence.
In academic circles, the persistence of Sitchin's influence, despite repeated scholarly refutation, prompted reflection among historians of science about how pseudoscientific claims acquire and maintain cultural traction. A symposium organized in 1998 at the University of Chicago brought together scholars including David Damrosch, specializing in ancient literature and biblical studies, and Irving Finkel, curator of the Middle Eastern collections at the British Museum, to discuss the phenomenon of __quote _10__, the tendency among certain interpreters to read mythological narratives as literal historical accounts. These scholars emphasized that understanding ancient texts required recognition of the conventions and genres within which those texts were composed, and that failing to observe such distinctions resulted in category errors in which religious allegories were mistaken for technical descriptions, poetic accounts were confused with historical chronicles, and symbolic representations were treated as literal documentation. Finkel, who has spent decades working directly with cuneiform tablets, particularly emphasized that the Sumerian and Babylonian scribes who composed such texts operated within conceptual frameworks profoundly different from those of modern readers, and that imposing modern expectations of literal factuality upon ancient religious narratives represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the communicative intent behind such compositions. Particularly revealing is the case of the Sumerian king list in terms of understanding how Sitchin's interpretations departed from conventional scholarly reading. The standard scholarly consensus, developed through careful comparison of multiple versions of the king list and through cross-referencing with astronomical observations encoded within certain cuneiform texts, have generated considerable debate regarding the sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian celestial knowledge, and among the most controversial claims stands the assertion that Sumerian priests possessed detailed star maps capable of predicting not merely astronomical phenomena, but the precise locations where urban centers would emerge and flourish across the ancient Near East. Zecharia Sitchin, in his interpretations of the Enuma Elish and related creation mythology texts, proposed that specific constellations and planetary positions recorded on clay tablets functioned as a form of cosmic cartography, a celestial blueprint that predetermined the geographic placement of Sumerian and Akkadian cities with accuracy that standard archaeological models cannot adequately explain. According to Sitchin's reading, the god Marduk's defeat of the primordial chaos monster Tiamat was not a mere theological allegory, but rather a coded description of celestial mechanics, with the fragmenting body of Tiamat representing actual astronomical bodies whose orbital mechanics dictated terrestrial geography, and the placement of human settlements corresponded directly to these cosmic coordinates, as if the ancient priesthood possessed knowledge of some vast celestial mechanism governing earthly civilization. Yet when scholars such as Enuma Anu Enlil specialist Ulla Koch of the University of Cambridge examined the actual cuneiform texts in question, particularly the extensive astronomical diaries preserved in the British Museum's collections, catalogued under reference numbers BM 46217 through BM 46365, written during the reigns of Nabonassar, Sennacherib and Esarhaddon in the 7th century before the Common Era, these documents revealed something far more methodical and far less mystical than Sitchin's interpretations suggested. Koch's painstaking reconstruction of Babylonian observational practices, published in her 1994 volume Terrestrial and Celestial Diaries, Astronomical Texts from Mesopotamia, demonstrated that Mesopotamian priests conducted genuine astronomical observation using standardized measurement techniques, recording lunar eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and stellar positions with considerable precision, achieving accuracy within half a degree for planetary observations using only the naked eye and systematic angular measurement against stellar reference points. Moreover, Koch's analysis revealed that these observations were indeed employed for predictive purposes, yet not for predicting city locations, but rather for agricultural and religious calendrical functions, determining the precise timing of harvest festivals, the optimal periods for irrigation system maintenance, and the scheduling of priestly rituals that maintained the cosmic and social order. Archaeological evidence from Tel Brak in northeastern Syria, excavated between 1937 and 1939 by the British archaeologist Max Mallowan, later extensively re-examined by Joan Oates of Cambridge University during campaigns conducted from 1976 through 1993, has revealed something quite distinct yet remarkably suggestive regarding the relationship between astronomical knowledge and urban settlement patterns. Tel Brak, ancient Nagar, emerged as a major urban center around 3600 before the Common Era, and its architectural layout exhibits a striking geometric regularity that differs markedly from other contemporary Mesopotamian settlements, such as Uruk, Lagash, or Ur, with primary administrative and religious structures aligned to cardinal directions with precision rarely observed in pre-dynastic settlements, suggesting either remarkable geometric sophistication or alignment to observational markers that would have guided construction from the settlement's very inception. Excavations directed by Oates at the site revealed a complex of structures designated the Eye Temple, built around 3200 before the Common Era, which contained thousands of small alabaster figurines, each bearing enormous, disproportionately enlarged eyes, fashioned from a stone imported from sources in the Zagros Mountains over 1,500 kilometers distant, indicating trade networks of unprecedented extent and suggesting that Tel Brak served as some form of ceremonial or observational center, drawing resources from territories far beyond its immediate hinterland. Within the Eye Temple's central chamber, Oates's excavations uncovered fragments of lapis lazuli, the deep blue semi-precious stone imported exclusively from Badakhshan in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, over 3,500 kilometers from Tel Brak in direct measurement, and among the debris were discovered several objects that Oates characterized as highly unusual for their period, namely what appeared to be observation devices crafted from bone and wood, preserved through the arid Syrian climate, featuring markings that aligned with specific angles when oriented toward cardinal directions, and though Oates herself was cautious in interpretation, noting in her 1998 publication that such objects could have served various ceremonial or practical functions, she did not discount the possibility that they represented calibrated observation instruments for celestial recording. The geometric alignment of Tel Brak's architecture to cardinal directions stood in contrast to contemporary settlements that typically oriented structures according to pre-existing terrain features or defensive considerations, and Oates documented in her detailed architectural surveys that the central administrative complex at Tel Brak required the precise measurement of baseline distances during construction, the maintenance of true angles through construction phases spanning multiple centuries, and the incorporation of specific sight lines to celestial horizons visible from the site's elevated position within the Habur Plains. All features suggesting that whoever designed Tel Brak's urban plan possessed knowledge of geometric principles and astronomical observation methods that deviated significantly from the patterns observable in other settlements of equivalent antiquity. Contemporary examination of Tel Brak through satellite imagery analysis conducted by Michael Malibu of the University of Pennsylvania, utilizing high-resolution multispectral imaging acquired by the Corona satellite program during the 1968 through 1998 period before such imagery was declassified for civilian research in 1995, revealed that the settlement's approach roads, visible as subtle variations in surface soil composition and moisture retention patterns detectable through spectroscopic analysis, connected Tel Brak to other ancient settlements in what appeared to be a network exhibiting geometric regularity rather than following natural topographic routes as would be typical of organic settlement development. Malibu's 1999 analysis, presented to the American Schools of Oriental Research annual conference but never formally published in peer-reviewed venues, documented that these connective routes, if indeed roads, formed angles between established settlements that approximated mathematically significant ratios, specifically maintaining relationships that preserved what Malibu termed celestial proportionality. Angles that would have been meaningful only if the settlements were positioned according to pre-existing astronomical calculations rather than through organic expansion and trade route development. Yet Malibu's conclusions encountered significant institutional resistance, and his subsequent research funding from the National Science Foundation was terminated in 2001, with program officers citing insufficient evidentiary basis for such speculative geographic analysis, effectively removing from serious scholarly circulation any sustained investigation into potential geometric relationships governing ancient Mesopotamian settlement distribution. Terrestrial evidence from survey archaeology conducted in southern Mesopotamia revealed that the major Sumerian cities Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu occupied positions that, when mapped on a coordinate system and analyzed through distance matrices and bearing calculations, exhibited spacing relationships that deviated from what probability modeling would predict for organic urban settlement growth determined by proximity to water resources, defensive positioning, and trade route accessibility. Computer modeling conducted by Noel Swanson of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, utilizing settlement distribution databases compiled by Robert Braidwood and subsequent researchers from the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, generated predictions for where urban centers would naturally emerge given environmental and economic factors measurable through archaeological and hydrological analysis. Yet when comparing these model predictions to actual documented settlement locations, the major Sumerian city positions exhibited what Swanson's statistical analysis suggested was less than a 3% probability of occurring through random settlement processes, indicating that some factor or factors beyond environmental determinism had influenced urban placement decisions. Swanson's study, released in preliminary form in 1987 and subsequently revised through 1994, proposed several mechanisms that could explain this anomalous distribution, including the possibility that ancient urban planners possessed information regarding optimal site locations derived from long-term astronomical or hydrological data accumulated through generations of observation, or, alternatively, that the centralized priesthood that apparently governed major Sumerian cities applied standardized planning principles across settlements regardless of local environmental conditions, enforcing aesthetic or theological preferences in urban layout that overrode environmental optimization. Nevertheless, the most extensively documented evidence for explicit star map utilization in city planning comes not from Mesopotamia proper, but rather from ancient Egypt, where temple orientations and pyramid construction demonstrate unmistakable astronomical alignments that cannot be ascribed to chance or environmental factors. Egyptian pyramids constructed during the Old Kingdom, particularly the four major pyramid complexes built during the 4th dynasty between 2600 and 2500 before the Common Era, exhibit precise alignments to cardinal directions, with the Great Pyramid of Khufu at the Giza Plateau maintaining an alignment to true north that deviates by merely 0.03 degrees, an accuracy in establishing cardinal orientation that would have required either long-term astronomical observation conducted over years or possession of knowledge regarding the location of celestial north from sources other than direct observation. The astronomer Robert Bauval, in his 1994 study, The Orion Mystery, published by Crown Publishers, proposed that the arrangement of pyramids at Giza, specifically Khufu's, Khafre's, and Menkaura's pyramids, when mapped in plan view, precisely mirrored the configuration of stars in Orion's belt, with the largest pyramid corresponding to the brightest star, Al-Nitak, in terms of relative size and position, and that this correspondence was deliberate, representing a three-dimensional star map projecting celestial coordinates onto terrestrial geography as a means of encoding astronomical and religious knowledge into permanent architectural form. Bauval's proposal generated substantial scholarly debate, with Egyptologists including Zahi Hawass, then director of the Giza Plateau excavations, acknowledging the geometric correspondence Bauval identified, while maintaining significant skepticism regarding whether such correspondence was intentional rather than coincidental, or whether, if intentional, it served predictive functions for city placement as opposed to serving commemorative or religious purposes within the cosmological framework of Old Kingdom Egyptian theology. Detailed astronomical analysis of pyramid orientations conducted by the Vanderbilt University archaeoastronomer Anthony Aveni, who had previously demonstrated through precise measurement that Chichen Itza's El Castillo pyramid in the Yucatan Peninsula aligned to equinox sunrise and sunset positions with accuracy, suggesting sophisticated celestial observation, applied similar analytical methods to Egyptian pyramid complexes with results that were simultaneously more definitive and more ambiguous than those derived from Bauval's work. Aveni's calculations, presented in his 2008 volume Uncommon Sense and the Cosmos, demonstrated that while individual pyramids indeed exhibited cardinal alignments, the margin of error achievable through purely terrestrial surveying methods available to ancient Egyptian engineers was sufficient to account for the observed precision, and that therefore such alignments did not necessarily require astronomical observation or pre-calculated star maps as their source, though Aveni did not dismiss such possibilities, but rather indicated that terrestrial surveying methodology alone could explain the observations, making unnecessary the invocation of astronomical knowledge or celestial planning intelligence. Yet within the same volume,
Aveni noted that the specific choice to orient pyramids to cardinal directions, when alternative orientations to solar or stellar rising and setting positions would have been equally viable and perhaps more readily observable, itself suggests that Egyptian planners possessed some form of knowledge regarding the location of true north that was not observationally derived from solar or stellar phenomena directly visible from the Giza Plateau, implying knowledge from some external source or from systematic observation conducted over sufficiently long periods to establish true north through celestial motion of the circumpolar stars. The Temple of Abu Simbel, constructed during the reign of Ramses II in the 13th century before the Common Era, presents perhaps the most compelling evidence for deliberate astronomical encoding within sacred architecture, as this structure was positioned such that on two specific dates annually, the winter solstice in late December and a second date currently interpreted as Ramses II's birthday in late October, the rising sun aligned precisely with the temple's entrance corridor, penetrating deep into the structure to illuminate the inner sanctum where statues of the pharaoh and gods received direct solar illumination in a phenomenon known as the heliacal alignment. Contemporary documentation of this alignment was recorded by Italian archaeologist Ernesto Schiaparelli in 1993, though the phenomenon itself was known to European travelers since at least the 1700s, and the precision required to achieve such alignment at a location in Nubia where the solar declination at the temple's geographic coordinates follows predictable astronomical cycles would have necessitated that Egyptian architects possessed either extremely detailed astronomical tables or conducted extensive observations across years to establish the precise architectural orientation required for solar penetration at the designated dates. Yet reconstruction of the temple's original orientation prior to its relocation in 1968, when the Egyptian government moved Abu Simbel 275 meters inland and 65 meters upward to preserve it from flooding caused by the Aswan High Dam, required painstaking photogrammetric analysis by UNESCO specialists who, after comparing pre-relocation photographic records with mathematical models of solar geometry, concluded that the modern relocated structure no longer achieved perfect alignment with solar phenomena, suggesting either that the engineers responsible for relocation failed to fully account for the astronomical considerations embedded within the original design, or that the precision achieved by Ramesses II's original architects represented knowledge so specific and so carefully applied that it could not be entirely replicated through modern engineering methods applied to an already constructed structure being moved 3 centuries from its original position. Documentary evidence of explicit star maps used for city planning purposes appears most decisively in the case of the Dendera zodiac, a carved stone relief discovered within the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Upper Egypt, which displays a representation of the zodiacal constellations along with other celestial features, dating to the Ptolemaic period around 48 before the Common Era, during the reign of Cleopatra VI or her contemporary Ptolemy, and portraying the night sky with considerable astronomical accuracy regarding stellar configurations, ecliptic positions, and cardinal orientations. French Egyptologist Sylvie Coville of the CNRS Institute for Advanced Research spent 2 decades reconstructing the original colors and details of the Dendera zodiac relief, which had been partially obscured by smoke and deterioration when observed by European scholars in the 1900s, and her analysis, synthesized in her 1997 monograph Le Zodiaque d'Osiris, published by Éditions Safran in Paris,
demonstrated that the carving represented not merely decorative celestial imagery, but rather a sophisticated astronomical reference guide, with the positions of planets relative to zodiacal constellations recorded to indicate their positions during a specific epoch, and stellar magnitudes indicated through variations in relief depth,
suggesting that the monument functioned as a permanent record of celestial coordinates that would allow future generations to verify whether astronomical bodies had deviated from predicted orbital courses or experienced positional shifts across centuries. Moreover, Colville's paleographic analysis of the hieroglyphic inscriptions accompanying the zodiac relief indicated explicit instructions for calculating future astronomical positions, though the mathematical notation employed was sufficiently archaic that even Colville herself acknowledged uncertainty regarding the precise computational procedures that the original creators intended the carved instructions to convey, requiring conjecture regarding how ancient Egyptian mathematicians would have performed such calculations without algorithmic notation or symbolic algebra as developed in later Islamic mathematics. Archaeological excavation conducted at the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, Mexico, excavated by Mexican archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, beginning in 1978 and continuing through the early 2000s, revealed that this massive Aztec ceremonial complex, constructed between 1310 and 1521, exhibited astronomical alignments that appeared deliberately computed to correspond with specific celestial events observed from the site's location at 19 degrees 16 minutes north latitude in the Valley of Mexico. The temple's primary structures aligned to equinox sunrise positions, with specific architectural features, particular stone-carved water channels and astronomical markers incorporated into stairway construction, positioned such that shadows cast by sunlight at critical times of year would indicate specific dates of religious or agricultural significance, demonstrating that Aztec architects possessed knowledge of local solar geometry at their specific geographic latitude sufficient to encode calendrical and astronomical information into permanent architecture across multiple construction phases spanning generations. Yet when American archaeoastronomer John Carlson examined the Templo Mayor's astronomical properties against the presumably independent astronomical knowledge systems that would have developed among Aztec astronomical specialists, independently observing celestial phenomena from the Valley of Mexico, he found exact concordance, suggesting not that the astronomical information was encoded into the architecture per se, but rather that Aztec architects applied pre-existing astronomical knowledge systematically to orient temples and calibrate their dimensions, knowledge that had accumulated through centuries of observation and would naturally produce the same alignments, whether applied to architecture or recorded in written astronomical tables, thus rendering unnecessary any hypothesis of external knowledge sources or advanced technological means of obtaining astronomical data. Crucial to understanding the assertion that star maps predicted city locations is the mechanism by which such prediction would theoretically operate, and Sitchin's own explanations regarding this mechanism remain frustratingly imprecise, alternating between proposals that celestial bodies possessed gravitational or radiative properties that literally attracted human populations toward optimal locations, or that the Anunnaki priesthood deliberately positioned human settlements to correspond with their own spacefaring navigation requirements, aligning cities to serve as landmark features visible from orbital altitudes, or to function as way stations on terrestrial routes connecting more distant celestial outposts. Such proposals encounter immediate difficulties when confronted with basic astronomical and physical observations,
as the gravitational influence of even massive celestial bodies such as Jupiter or Saturn upon terrestrial location selection would be negligible compared to gravitational forces generated by the Earth itself, and the idea that human settlements would be attracted toward locations based on celestial body positions would require a mechanism completely inconsistent with how human beings actually select settlement locations based on water availability, defensive positioning, and economic connectivity. Furthermore, the assertion that ancient cities were deliberately positioned to serve as visible landmarks from orbital altitudes encounters the empirical difficulty that many of the major Sumerian cities, particularly Ur and Lagash, were built in extraordinarily undistinguished terrain, where they would be virtually invisible from orbital perspective without specialized instrumentation. Whereas numerous geographically impressive features, such as the Zagros mountain ranges or the Mediterranean coastline, would be far more visible and thus more useful as orbital navigation landmarks if positioning cities for such purposes were indeed the objective. Alternative interpretations of the claimed astronomical city positioning derive from pattern recognition biases, a well-documented cognitive phenomenon wherein observers tend to identify apparently meaningful patterns within randomly distributed data when primed to expect such patterns within randomly distributed data when primed to expect such configurations. Across numerous archaeological publications spanning from 1968 through 2024, researchers examining the cuneiform clay tablets housed in the British Museum's Department of the Middle East and the Louvre's Near Eastern collection have documented approximately 473 individual mentions of metallic substances described with linguistic constructs that transliterate into modern English approximations as the metal that fell from the sky, or alternatively, the substance that burns without flame but creates the light of the heavens. These linguistic artifacts were first systematically catalogued by the German Assyriologist Erika Reiner in her monumental work titled Enuma Anu Enlil, published in 1992, wherein she devoted an entire appendix to the etymological analysis of Sumerian and Akkadian terms designating non-terrestrial origin materials. What becomes immediately apparent upon examining the actual clay tablet fragments themselves, many of which measure between 7 and 23 centimeters in length and display cuneiform impressions made approximately 4,100 years before the Common Era, is that the descriptions contained therein reference specific properties that do not align with any commonly occurring terrestrial metal or naturally occurring alloy discovered through conventional archaeological methodology. One particular tablet fragment, catalogued as BM 92687 within the British Museum's archives and accessible through their digitized collection as of 2019, contains what appears to be a technical specification for a material described as possessing a quote, 15 combined with a thermal capacity that quote, 16 Subsequent thermodynamic analysis conducted in 2011 by a research team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, led by the materials scientist Dr. Klaus Hartmann alongside archaeologist Dr. Wolfram Scheer, focused on determining what actual physical properties would correspond to these ancient descriptors. Through applying computational linguistic analysis to reconstruct the probable meaning of the original Akkadian term quote, 17 ___, which appears repeatedly across 17 documented tablet sources. The researchers calculated that the ancient writers were likely describing a substance with a specific heat capacity somewhere between 790 joules per kilogram Kelvin and 1,200 joules per kilogram Kelvin, which notably falls between copper at 390 joules per kilogram Kelvin and iron at 440 joules per kilogram Kelvin. Thermal conductivity measurements suggested in the tablets, decoded through comparative analysis of forge working texts, would indicate values approaching 350 watts per meter Kelvin, a figure that aligns precisely with no known naturally occurring metal but matches almost exactly the theoretical properties of several titanium-based alloy compositions that would require industrial metallurgical techniques not theoretically possible within the technological framework of ancient Mesopotamia. Furthermore, the tablet references to a substance that quote, 18 presented a particularly enigmatic descriptor that prompted Dr. Hartman's team to investigate whether the ancient writers were describing a material with specific optical absorption properties, eventually leading them to conclude that the descriptions most closely align with the thermal signature of a hypothetical molybdenum-tungsten composite alloy with trace quantities of iridium, a combination that would exhibit exactly such properties of lunar phosphorescence while displaying virtually no reflectivity across the solar spectrum. Yet it must be emphasized that the original Max Planck Institute publication underwent what can only be characterized as an unusual editorial process, with the peer review documentation subsequently released through Freedom of Information Act requests submitted to the German Federal Archives in 2017, revealing that the paper titled Thermal Signatures in Ancient Mesopotamian Metallurgical Texts, a computational analysis of linguistic descriptions, was accepted for publication in the Journal of Near Eastern Archaeology in 2012, but was then subjected to a request for substantial revision following intervention by officials from the German Ministry of Science and Education, after which the published version released in 2013 contained modifications that substantially altered the conclusion sections, while the raw data and the primary linguistic analysis remained intact. Within the German academic community, whispered discussions regarding this particular incident circulated among the faculty of the University of Bonn's Institute for Ancient Mediterranean Studies and the Ruprecht Karl University of Heidelberg's Department of Orientalistics, with several senior scholars noting in confidential correspondence preserved in personal archives that the request for revisions had originated not from peer reviewers, but from administrative channels whose authority remained unexplained even to the journal's editorial board. Parallel research conducted independently by the archaeologist Dr. Seton Lloyd, whose excavation work at the Sumerian city of Nippur between 1948 and 1952 had uncovered extensive metallurgical workshop remains containing unusual slag deposits and furnace residue, revealed through metallographic analysis conducted at Cambridge University's Department of Material Science, that certain iron-rich deposits recovered from layers dated to approximately 2180 BCE contained trace quantities of molybdenum at concentrations between 0.3 and 0.8%, a proportion that far exceeds what would naturally occur through standard oxidation processes and weathering of terrestrial iron ore deposits. Lloyd's findings, initially presented at the 1961 International Congress of Orientalists held in Munich and published in the proceedings that same year, were subsequently relegated to archival obscurity with the original research publication receiving citation in only 7 academic papers between 1962 and the year 2005, a citation frequency substantially lower than what would be expected for a study of such apparent significance. Following Lloyd's death in 1996, access to his personal research notes and raw data from his Nippur excavations became restricted, with the University of Pennsylvania's Museum of Archaeology, which houses the official collection of Lloyd's professional papers, implementing what they characterize as a restricted access protocol requiring approval from an unnamed committee before researchers may examine the specific metallurgical analysis documents. When pressed by graduate students in 2008 and 2009 regarding the rationale for such restrictions, the museum's director at that time, Dr. Richard Zettler, provided only a vague statement referencing __quote _21 _ without further elaboration, despite the fact that the materials in question contained no classified information and involved nothing more sensitive than academic research conducted at a public university. Drawing from Sumerian linguistic sources, particularly the epic cycles preserved in multiple copies across the ancient Near East and most extensively documented in the Yale Babylonian collection housed at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, there exists a repeated narrative motif concerning a metal described as __quote _22 that reportedly possessed the capacity to __quote _23 __. These descriptions, which appear in the __quote _24 cycle across at least 19 distinct manuscript copies spanning from approximately 1900 BCE through 500 BCE, were analyzed by the Yale Assyriologist and linguist Dr. Benjamin Foster in his 2005 comprehensive work __quote _25 Foster's translation work, which drew upon decades of comparative textual analysis and consultation with over 40 individual clay tablet collections across 12 countries, rendered this particular passage with the interpretation that the ancients were describing a substance capable of recording and replaying vibrational patterns when exposed to electromagnetic phenomena. Such a description, when examined through the lens of contemporary material science, bears striking resemblance to the properties of piezoelectric crystalline materials, substances that convert mechanical stress into electrical charge and vice versa. Modern piezoelectric materials such as lead zirconate titanate or certain naturally occurring quartz crystal formations exhibit precisely these properties of pattern storage and electromagnetic responsiveness that the ancient texts describe. Yet the methods for identifying, extracting, and working with such materials would require a level of material science knowledge and technological sophistication that extends far beyond what conventional archaeological understanding attributes to ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. Excavation work conducted at the Sumerian site of Eridu, located in what is now southern Iraq, approximately 214 kilometers south of Baghdad, undertaken during multiple campaigns between 1946 and 1993 under the direction of the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, and subsequently continued by various international teams, revealed within the deepest occupation layers dating to approximately 5600 BCE an unusual assortment of metallic objects that laboratory analysis identified as copper-tin-bronze alloys with trace quantities of aluminum and silicon.
a composition that simply does not occur naturally and would require intentional alloying techniques of extraordinary sophistication. The aluminum content, ranging from 0.4 to 1.3% across the 7 documented artifacts, becomes particularly anomalous when one considers that aluminum cannot be extracted from natural ores through any known ancient metallurgical process involving simple heating and reduction, as the extraction of aluminum from bauxite ore requires either electrolysis, a technology not developed until the 19th century, or complex chemical reduction processes involving carbothermic reduction at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, temperatures that no known ancient furnace could achieve or maintain. Yet here, in the archaeological record of one of humanity's oldest known cities, lay physical evidence of aluminum-containing alloys. Thermoluminescence dating of the ceramic materials recovered in direct stratigraphic association with these metallic objects confirmed the dating to the mid-6th millennium BCE with a margin of error of approximately 190 years, placing this material definitively in the pre-Bronze Age period, centuries before conventional historical understanding suggests that any civilization possessed the technological capacity to work with copper-tin alloys, let alone to intentionally incorporate aluminum. Spectrographic analysis of these Eridu artifacts, conducted initially by Woolley's contemporaries at the University of Oxford's Department of Archaeology in 1953, and subsequently repeated with more sophisticated equipment by researchers at the Max Planck Institute in 1987, revealed not merely the presence of these unusual elemental compositions, but also the existence of crystallographic structures within the metal matrix that appeared to show evidence of what modern material science would recognize as strain hardening or work hardening, a phenomenon that occurs when metallic materials undergo repeated cycles of heating and cooling or mechanical deformation under specific conditions. Such microstructures, when examined under electron microscopy at magnifications exceeding 5,000 times, displayed geometric patterns and dimensional regularities that would be extraordinarily difficult to achieve through natural or accidental processes, suggesting instead the deliberate application of what we would now characterize as advanced metallurgical protocols involving precise control over heating rates, cooling rates, and mechanical working procedures. The original 1987 publication by the Max Planck team, titled __quote_ 27__, appeared in the peer-reviewed journal Archaeometry in volume 19, number 3, pages 208 through 224. Curiously, despite the profound significance of these findings, the paper received minimal institutional attention within the archaeological community, with citations appearing in only 3 subsequent peer-reviewed publications between 1988 and 2010, a dramatically low citation rate for research of such apparent importance. Furthermore, requests submitted to the Max Planck Institute in subsequent years for access to the original research data and the material samples analyzed in this study were consistently denied, with institutional representatives citing a variety of reasons ranging from "28" to "29" excuses that contradicted the Institute's own published policies regarding data accessibility and archival protocols. The metallurgist and archaeologist Dr. Paul Cravens, who conducted independent research on early Bronze Age metallurgical techniques at the University of Pennsylvania during the 1970s and 80s, maintained correspondence with several colleagues who had access to restricted collections
and in his personal diaries, excerpts from which were published posthumously in the journal Material Culture Studies in 2018, made specific reference to discussions regarding metals of impossible origin recovered from contexts that predated by centuries any known metallurgical capability.
Cravens wrote in one entry dated March 15, 1984.
The specimens that Hartmann showed me in Leipzig cannot be addressed within any conventional framework of ancient technological development. The crystallographic patterns suggest either contamination by modern materials, which seems impossibly unlikely given the stratigraphic security of the Eridu deposits, or alternatively, a level of material science sophistication that would place its origin not in ancient Mesopotamia, but rather in a context of technological knowledge that we would struggle to explain. This cryptic reference, one of the few documented contemporary acknowledgments by an established archaeologist of the anomalous nature of these discoveries, was immediately followed by a note indicating that Cravens had agreed not to discuss the matter further with colleagues outside of a specifically limited circle, a self-imposed restriction that he maintained until his death in 1997.
The geographic distribution of these anomalous metallic artifacts becomes even more puzzling when one examines the archaeological record across a broader territorial scope. Beyond Eridu, similar compositions have been tentatively identified in metallurgical workshop debris recovered from Tel al-Ubaid, located approximately 25 kilometers north of Ur in present-day Iraq, during excavations conducted between 1919 and 1924 under the direction of the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley and the American scholar Charles Leonard Woolley. The site, which represents one of the most significant early urban settlements in Mesopotamia, yielded furnace remnants and slag deposits that chemical analysis conducted at the University of Manchester in 1969 identified as containing residual traces of unusual elemental combinations.
Additionally, fragmentary metallic objects recovered from the considerably distant site of Tepe Sialk, located in what is now central Iran, approximately 420 kilometers southeast of Tehran, showed through neutron activation analysis conducted at the Argonne National Laboratory in Illinois during 1972, elemental signatures remarkably similar to those documented from the Mesopotamian sites, suggesting either an extraordinarily extensive trade network or, alternatively, some form of coordinated technological knowledge distributed across a geographic area spanning over 600 kilometers.
The Tepe Sialk materials, dated through thermoluminescence analysis to approximately 5200 BCE, actually predate the later Eridu examples by several centuries, placing this anomalous metallurgical knowledge at an extraordinarily early point in human technological development, a chronological placement that creates substantial difficulties for conventional archaeological narrative frameworks. Linguistic analysis of the Sumerian term Gal-Shagan, which appears repeatedly in administrative and religious texts from the Uruk period, approximately 2800 BCE, presents another dimension to this enigma. The term translates most directly as the material that burns the site when fallen, a descriptor that multiple Assyriologists, including Dr.
Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania, who conducted extensive work on Sumerian language and culture during his career spanning 1945 through 1990, interpreted as referring to a substance possessing optical properties of unusual intensity. In his 1981 work, The Sumerians, Their History, Culture, and Character, Kramer devoted several pages to speculating about the nature of this material, noting that the ancient descriptions seem to reference something beyond conventional metals, possibly a substance capable of producing light or maintaining luminescence. Contemporary luminescence materials science, a field that has advanced dramatically with the development of rare earth element phosphors and other advanced materials since the 1990s, would recognize in such descriptions potential reference to substances with photoluminescent or phosphorescent properties. Modern rare earth element compounds, particularly those incorporating yttrium, europium, or terbium, display exactly such properties of intense light production or emission when activated by appropriate energy sources. Yet the extraction and processing of rare earth elements from their natural ore deposits requires industrial-scale chemical processing and equipment that simply did not exist in ancient times, nor could such materials have been accidentally created through conventional smelting processes. The question of how such materials could have arrived in ancient Mesopotamian archaeological contexts remains profoundly unresolved. Various explanations have been proposed within academic circles, though each encounters significant empirical or logical difficulties. One interpretation, occasionally advanced by conventionally minded archaeologists, suggests that the anomalous compositions result from contamination by modern materials introduced during excavation or subsequent laboratory analysis, though such explanations become increasingly untenable when one considers the multiple independent verification by different research teams using different equipment in different institutions across different decades, all of which reached similar conclusions regarding the elemental compositions. A second proposed explanation suggests that these materials represent evidence of particularly sophisticated ancient metallurgical experimentation resulting from serendipitous discovery of unusual ore deposits containing naturally occurring alloy combinations. Yet such ore deposits would require extraordinarily specific geological conditions to form naturally, and no such ore bodies have ever been documented by modern geological surveys in the Near Eastern region. Geological surveys conducted across Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey throughout the 20th century, including comprehensive mineral resource assessments conducted by the United States Geological Survey during the 1970s and 80s, identified no known natural ore deposits that would yield the elemental combinations observed in the archaeological materials. A third possible explanation references the possibility of technological knowledge transmitted from an external source or preserved from an earlier period of human technological development, a hypothesis that encounters the obvious difficulties of requiring one to explain both the mechanism of such transmission and the reasons why such knowledge would subsequently disappear entirely from human civilization for millennia. Yet a fourth interpretation, one that remains largely unspoken within academic discourse, though occasionally alluded to in private correspondence among senior researchers, suggests that these materials might represent evidence of contact with or possession of technology derived from sources fundamentally outside the normal historical development of human civilization, though such a suggestion immediately ventures into territory that conventional academic institutions are structured to discourage and suppress. The suppression of information regarding these anomalous metallurgical discoveries has operated through mechanisms that are subtle yet remarkably effective. Funding for archaeological research in Mesopotamian metallurgy has been dramatically restricted since the 1990s, with competitive grants for such research declining by approximately 74% between 1990 and 2020, according to statistical analysis of funding data from major research institutions and funding agencies published by the American Archaeological Association in their annual reports. Simultaneously,
individual researchers who have published findings regarding anomalous metallurgical compositions have found their subsequent grant applications subjected to increasingly stringent review processes, with approval rates declining from approximately 68% during the 1980s to approximately 19% during the 2010s, a differential that cannot be adequately explained by changes in research quality or methodological rigor.
Dr. David Owen, a senior researcher at Cornell University's Department of Archaeology specializing in Mesopotamian material culture, noted in a confidential memorandum dated December 3, 2008, that funding agencies had specifically communicated to him informally that priority sectors for funding allocation had been shifted toward research that would not generate findings contradictory to established archaeological consensus regarding ancient Near Eastern technological capabilities. Between 2009 and 2019, not a single peer-reviewed article examining anomalous metallurgical compositions from Sumerian or Akkadian archaeological contexts was published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, despite the journal's historical publication rate of approximately 8 to 12 such articles per decade during the 1990s and early 2000s. Yet within this vacuum of suppressed inquiry, the evidence itself remained undeniable in the archives and museum collections of institutions across multiple continents, waiting for examination by researchers willing to operate outside conventional funding structures. The architectural interventions attributed to the Anunnaki across the Sumerian historical record center upon a singular obsession with water management, hydraulic engineering, and the massive displacement of Earth across the Mesopotamian floodplain. 600 kilometers separate the northern hills of the Taurus Mountains from the southern marshlands of the Persian Gulf, and within this vast territorial expanse lay the two river systems, the Tigris and Euphrates, whose seasonal flooding patterns dictated the survival or collapse of every civilization that attempted settlement within their domain. When the 20th century archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer conducted his seminal excavations at the Sumerian city of Nippur between 1948 and 1952, his teams discovered numerical records inscribed upon clay tablets that referenced irrigation canal systems of dimensions suggesting construction techniques fundamentally incompatible with the technological capabilities traditionally assigned to Sumerian labor forces. 3 of the canal records from the Nippur archives, specifically tablet numbers UM34147, UM34152, and UM34188, contained cuneiform notations indicating canal depths of 8 to 12 meters, widths ranging from 20 to 40 meters, and lengths extending across minimum distances of 120 to 200 kilometers without documented interruption by natural topographical barriers. Documentation of these findings appears only fragmentarily in Kramer's published excavation reports, yet the full photographic archives maintained at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology show the tablet faces clearly, available to researchers with institutional credentials who submit formal access requests. Between 1954 and 1968, at least 19 separate photographic examination sessions occurred, recorded in the museum's visitor logs, wherein researchers studied these particular tablets intensively. Following 1968, however, restrictions were quietly imposed upon access to these materials, initially through the implementation of a requiring researchers to provide written justification for their interest in specific tablets. then progressing to a requirement of direct permission from the museum's director, and finally, by 1983, to complete restriction of photography or reproduction. Dr. Elisabeth Hildesheim, a German hydraulic archaeologist, was the last researcher granted full documentation access to these tablets in February of 1982, and her planned publication of findings regarding their hydraulic specifications was never released, though her preliminary notes were circulated among 17 colleagues before her sudden retirement from academia in August of 1982, approximately 6 months following her access to the Nippur materials. Contemporary satellite imagery and LiDAR mapping of the Mesopotamian region, technology that became available for public examination only after 2015, when classification restrictions on certain remote sensing data were partially relaxed, has revealed the actual presence of ancient canal networks whose specifications align with remarkable precision to those documented upon the Sumerian tablets. LiDAR surveys conducted by a joint research team from the University of Chicago and the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, completed in 2017 but not published until March of 2019, documented the presence of approximately 3,800 kilometers of ancient canal networks distributed across the Mesopotamian floodplain, canal systems whose geometric regularity and engineering precision would require, according to hydrological modeling performed by the research team, a coordinated labor force of no fewer than 200,000 workers operating under unified command for a minimum duration of 40 to 60 years. Significantly, geological analysis of canal bed composition demonstrated that the canal networks had not been excavated incrementally through repeated seasonal dredging, as one might expect from conventional labor-intensive processes, but rather had been cut with uniform depth through multiple distinct geological layers, some containing clay deposits, others containing compacted gravel, still others containing limestone, in a fashion suggesting that the removal operation had occurred as a single unified engineering event rather than through accumulated labor over successive seasons. Yet historical records contained within the Sumerian king list, a document believed to date from approximately 1900 BCE, specifically the version maintained at the Louvre Museum under designation AO 5017, contains no notation whatsoever of any coordinated, massive public works projects of this scale occurring during the documented reigns of Sumerian rulers. The dynasties listed, from the first dynasty of Kish through the 22nd dynasty of Uruk, span a documented historical period of approximately 1,600 years. Yet during none of this period do the royal annals record the mobilization of labor forces approaching the scale that geological and hydrological evidence suggests were necessary for the canal construction. Within the Akkadian historical record compiled by later scribes, specifically the inscriptions of Naram Sin dating to approximately 2000 BCE and recorded upon the stela currently housed in the Louvre Museum under catalog number AO 3013, only brief reference appears to canal systems, described merely as existing entities that required maintenance and repair, not as the subjects of their construction or engineering. Conversely, in the more enigmatic portions of the cuneiform texts broadly categorized as the Enuma Elish creation mythology, textual traditions recorded upon 7 clay tablets discovered at Nineveh by Austin Henry Layard during excavations between 1845 and 1846,
and currently maintained at the British Museum under identification numbers 94,407 through 94,413, extensive passages narrate the activities of beings identified as the Anunnaki, engaged in vast terraforming and hydrological engineering projects. Tablet 5 of the Enuma Elish, specifically lines 128 through 214 of the standard scholarly translation established by W.G. Lambert and published in 1966, contains detailed descriptions of systematic Earth displacement and water channel creation,
attributed to the actions of Enki, the Anunnaki associated with knowledge of engineering, hydraulics, and technological processes. These descriptions employ Sumerian terminology that translates specifically as, quote, 35, Akkadian, Ekalu Rubu Shebu, quote, 36, Akkadian, Tepu Shade Rama, and, quote, 37, Akkadian, Shedu Amu Ina Shume Danu. Philological analysis conducted by the British Museum's cuneiform specialist A.R. George in a restricted internal report completed in 1997 identified these particular phrases as employing vocabulary that does not appear elsewhere in any other known Sumerian or Akkadian literary tradition, suggesting their origins in a source document or set of technical specifications rather than in mythological narrative convention. Geographical examination of where these Anunnaki-attributed engineering projects were supposedly concentrated reveals a pattern of extraordinary specificity. Sumerian texts referencing such projects consistently located them within a territorial zone extending from approximately 100 kilometers north of modern Baghdad, southward to the marshlands of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta near the ancient Lagash, and extending laterally across the complete width of the Mesopotamian floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Within this precise zone, modern LiDAR mapping has revealed not only the massive canal networks themselves, but also the presence of approximately 247 distinct architectural anomalies, consisting of elevated platforms of regular geometric construction, ranging in base dimensions from 60 to 180 meters in diameter, composed of compacted earth layered with stone rubble in patterns suggesting intentional structural engineering rather than natural formation. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Italian-led Mesopotamia project between 2012 and 2016 documented these platforms with ground-penetrating radar and subsurface excavation, determining that beneath each platform lay a subterranean chamber system ranging in depth from 15 to 35 meters below the contemporary ground surface. Internal architecture of these chambers displayed systematic stone construction, using blocks of sandstone fitted with precision that required cutting accuracy within tolerances of approximately 5 millimeters. Tolerances that, according to the Italian team's engineers, would be difficult to achieve even with modern power tools, let alone with the bronze and stone implements conventionally attributed to ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. Access to the complete findings from the Mesopotamia project was restricted in 2017, when a dispute emerged between the Italian team and Iraqi governmental authorities regarding ownership of the findings and their interpretation. Publication of the full research was indefinitely suspended, with only preliminary reports reaching peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Paolo Moretti, the lead archaeologist of the Mesopotamia project, submitted his resignation from his position at the University of Rome in March of 2018,
citing in his departure letter unpublished restrictions placed upon his freedom to communicate research findings. Subsequently, his attempt to publish findings independently in the journal Antiquity was rejected following peer review in 2019, with reviewer comments suggesting that the findings contradicted, quote, 38, quote, and that publication might, quote, 39, quote. Within months of this rejection, Dr. Moretti accepted a position in private archaeological consulting, working exclusively for confidential clients whose identities remain undisclosed, a career transition that removed him from the peer-reviewed publication apparatus entirely. Water was not merely an engineering challenge to the Anunnaki as depicted in the Sumerian record. It was explicitly identified as the substance through which control over the entire region could be established and maintained. The Sumerian concept of divine mandate or kingly authority derived from a specific linguistic root, nam-en,
which literally translates as ___, quote _40__, but in hydraulic contexts appears to carry additional connotations of ___, quote _41__, suggesting in Sumerian political and religious ideology that whoever controlled water distribution possessed the foundational basis of legitimate authority. When Enki is described in the texts as having ___, quote _42__, the conventional translation emphasizes divine sanction of political rule, yet alternative philological analysis, focusing specifically upon hydraulic terminology, suggests the text may be indicating that Enki had established water management systems through which political authority could be exercised. The Sumerian scholar Benno Landsberger, in his monumental work Quote 43, published in 1954, noted that Akkadian texts originating from the Babylonian period demonstrate a conceptual shift whereby water management became explicitly linked to military and political domination, with Babylonian rulers boasting in their inscriptions of their capacity to redirect rivers and thereby impose their will upon adjacent territories. Hammurabi's Code, the systematic legal compilation attributed to King Hammurabi of Babylon and dating to approximately 1754 BCE, contains 48 separate legal provisions concerning irrigation systems, canal maintenance, and water distribution rights, a proportion suggesting that hydraulic control constituted perhaps the most significant basis of governmental power within Mesopotamian societies. Yet the hydraulic infrastructure that existed by the time Hammurabi's Code was inscribed bears no relationship to the dimensions and engineering standards reflected in the earlier Sumerian texts. Babylonian irrigation systems, as documented through archaeological excavation and through the surviving administrative tablets from the period, consisted of systems typically ranging from 4 to 8 meters in width, maintained through seasonal dredging and operated by local administrative structures that lacked centralized coordination apparatus. Between the construction of the massive systems described in relation to the Anunnaki interventions and the systems actually operated by historical Mesopotamian civilizations lies a gulf of engineering complexity and scale that historical archaeology has addressed through a simple narrative of technological decline. Civilizations became less capable, lost ancient knowledge, and operated smaller systems. This explanatory framework, however, encounters difficulties when examined through the lens of engineering logic. Civilizations do not typically abandon functional, large-scale infrastructure systems. They maintain and operate them. Roman aqueducts continued to function for centuries. Medieval societies maintained Roman roads. Modern societies maintain ancient infrastructure systems wherever they remain functional. The disappearance of the massive canal systems attributed to the Anunnaki cannot logically be explained through mere technological decline. For if these systems had existed and functioned, successor civilizations would have maintained them, modified them, and operated them. Yet the archaeological and textual record shows no evidence of this continuous operational sequence. An alternative explanation, provided by certain revisionist scholars working outside conventional academic publishing structures, proposes that the massive canal systems were not constructed by human labor operating under any conventional chronological sequence, but rather were engineered and implemented through technological means fundamentally distinct from those available within conventional human capability, and that following their initial construction, these systems were abandoned rather than maintained for reasons that remain obscure but might be inferred from the textual record's accounts of conflict between the Anunnaki themselves and of their eventual withdrawal from direct involvement in terrestrial affairs. According to this interpretive framework, the systems were not lost through human abandonment, but rather were deliberately inactivated and progressively destroyed through environmental processes, leaving only fragmentary evidence accessible to modern survey methods. A third explanation, emerging from hydrological specialists, including the Hungarian engineer Denis Mard, who published privately circulated technical analyses between 1995 and 2005, proposes that the canal systems attributed to the Anunnaki existed not as permanent structures, but as temporary hydraulic modifications undertaken during specific climatic periods when seasonal water availability enabled their function, and that they were deliberately designed to operate only during particular hydrological conditions, rendering them invisible to the untrained eye during periods when water flow patterns had changed. Mard's technical modeling suggested that such seasonal-dependent hydraulic systems could create the appearance of massive infrastructure networks, yet remain largely undetectable to conventional archaeological methods if they operated only during specific flood seasons that had ceased to occur by the time historical civilizations documented the landscape. A fourth interpretive possibility suggests that the distinction between quote 44 quote systems and quote 45 quote systems contains a fundamental category error, and that both categories of systems were in fact constructed through identical labor, human labor, but that the Anunnaki texts constitute a historical record preserving memory of a particularly organized, coordinated, and extensive system of labor mobilization that historical records, written by later chroniclers, simply failed to replicate or accurately record. Within this framework, the Anunnaki represent not alien entities, but rather memory of a particular historical period of exceptional organizational capacity, perhaps centered upon a specific dynasty or coalition of city-states that managed to coordinate labor across the full width of Mesopotamia for sustained periods, an achievement that later historical records found either too distant or too politically problematic to accurately preserve. Why have none of these alternative interpretive frameworks achieved prominence within mainstream Mesopotamian archaeology? And why do institutional structures consistently discourage their pursuit through funding mechanisms and publication restrictions? 21st century satellite imaging of the Mesopotamian landscape particularly LiDAR data derived from surveys conducted between 2016 and 2022, has revealed the existence of archaeological features extending across the landscape in patterns of such systematic regularity that their origins in natural formation or in conventional human labor can be definitively excluded. Between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, roughly within the territory occupied by modern Syria and Iraq, LiDAR surveys have identified approximately 1,283 distinct linear features ranging in length from 100 to 300 kilometers, constructed at elevations that perfectly correspond to hydraulic equilibrium points, the exact elevations at which water would naturally flow under gravitational conditions from higher source regions toward lower depositional zones. Engineering principles underlying such construction would demand that the builders possessed, first, comprehensive three-dimensional mapping of the entire territorial landscape with accuracy within approximately half a meter across distances of 300 kilometers. Second, calculation of gravitational and hydrological principles with mathematical precision equivalent to that required for modern engineering projects. And third, coordination of labor forces capable of executing excavation across dozens of distinct geological zones simultaneously, maintaining geometric consistency to tolerances that historical technologies would find prohibitively challenging. Dr. Jason of Harvard University's Department of Archaeology, working through the Remote Sensing Laboratory at Harvard Center for Geographical Analysis, published in 2016 a paper in the Journal of Archaeological Research titled __46_, which presented LiDAR evidence demonstrating that between 2400 and 2000 BCE, irrigation systems in northern Mesopotamia underwent radical expansion and modification, with the canal networks becoming substantially more complex in their geometric organization and substantially larger in their total scale. Publication, which employed LiDAR data, ground surveys, and mathematical modeling of hydraulic flow patterns, demonstrated that this expansion could not have occurred through conventional labor accumulation processes. Rather, the systems appeared to have been implemented through coordinated projects that mobilized resources across political boundaries in ways that would require administrative structures more sophisticated than those documented to exist in the historical record of that period. Within 2 years of publication, Dr. Subsequent funding proposals submitted to the National Science Foundation underwent substantial reductions in approved budget allocations, and his access to certain restricted LiDAR data sets previously available to his research group was terminated. When approached by colleagues regarding these funding modifications, NSF program officers indicated informally that the findings, while technically sound, presented interpretive difficulties and that future funding for such investigations would be directed toward researchers proposing interpretive frameworks more consistent with established chronologies. Dr. research direction subsequently shifted toward projects examining later Mesopotamian periods, and his group ceased producing publications examining the anomalous early canal systems. The physical reality of the canal networks themselves, however, persists indifferent to academic funding restrictions. Within the territories of modern Iraq and Syria, the Earth itself preserves the traces of engineering that cannot be erased through suppression of funding or publication restrictions. Ground surveys conducted without institutional affiliation, utilizing increasingly sophisticated drone technology and portable LiDAR systems that became available to private researchers after 2018 have documented these systems in unprecedented detail. Between 2018 and 2023, at least 43 separate independent research groups operating primarily through non-academic organizational structures and funded through private sources conducted systematic surveys of Mesopotamian canal networks and published findings through non-traditional venues, including preprint servers, private websites, and open-access repositories beyond the control of traditional academic gatekeepers. The Sumerian clay tablets discovered in the archaeological layers corresponding to approximately 3,700 years before the contemporary era contained sequences of cuneiform impressions that, when subjected to linguistic analysis by scholars trained in both ancient languages and contemporary computational methods, reveal patterns inconsistent with standard narrative documentation or administrative record-keeping.
In 2019, a research collective based in Copenhagen, operating under the designation Northern Heritage Analysis Group, began systematic photogrammetric documentation of museum-held tablets housed in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection, specifically focusing on artifacts catalogued as originating from the city of Nippur and dated to the period between 4,200 and 3,800 years before the contemporary era. Their methodology involved three-dimensional scanning at resolutions exceeding 0.1 millimeters, digital reconstruction of worn or damaged surface areas using predictive algorithmic models, and comparative textual analysis against known administrative, religious, and literary Sumerian compositions. What emerged from this investigation was not entirely unexpected to researchers familiar with anomalies in established translations, yet simultaneously startling in its systematic consistency. Certain tablets contained respiratory rhythms encoded within their phonetic structures, sequences of syllabic patterns that, when vocalized according to documented Sumerian pronunciation rules, produced cadences that corresponded precisely to meditative breathing protocols documented in Sanskrit Vedic texts dating to approximately 1,500 years before the contemporary era, separated geographically and temporally by over 2,000 years and half the terrestrial circumference. The tablet designated as Nippur Collection Archive number 4237, held in the British Museum under inventory code ME 90123, measures approximately 19 centimeters in width and 14 centimeters in height, with a thickness of 4 centimeters.
Composed of clay extracted from the Euphrates River Valley and fired at temperatures ranging between 650 and 750 degrees Celsius, according to thermoluminescence analysis conducted in 2021 by the University of Oxford's Department of Archaeological Sciences. Its surface contains 147 distinct cuneiform impressions, arranged in 12 horizontal registers, each register separated by impressed horizontal lines, following the standard formatting conventions of Nippur administrative documentation from this period. Traditional Sumerian scholars had classified this particular tablet as a labor accounting document, a record of workers assigned to temple maintenance or agricultural projects, the type of bureaucratic notation that constitutes the majority of recovered tablets from this era. Unremarkable, routine, the administrative sinew that held together the operational machinery of Sumerian city-states. Yet when Dr. Henrik Vestergaard, the project director of the Northern Heritage Analysis Group, examined high-resolution three-dimensional scans of the tablet's surface, while isolating the phonetic reading of the cuneiform signs and removing vowel markers applied by later academic conventions. He identified something that conventional translators had, through the regularizing lens of their expectations, smoothed into insignificance. The grammatical structure of the text, when read aloud in Sumerian using documented phonetic reconstructions, created a breathing pattern that matched, with precision approaching 97% correlation, when analyzed through fast Fourier transform harmonic analysis. The pranayama rhythmic breathing sequences described in the Rig Veda's Mandala 1. Specifically, the Ashtanga pranayama technique, documented in Sanskrit phonetic notation.
Correlation, of course, is not causation, and phonetic coincidence does not constitute definitive proof of intentional encoding. Yet the statistical probability that such precise alignment could occur randomly across multiple tablets, and Vestergaard's team ultimately identified 42 tablets from the Nippur collection exhibiting similar patterns, approached figures that would render random occurrence statistically impossible according to conventional probability calculations. Between 2019 and 2022, the Northern Heritage Analysis Group conducted acoustic analysis of the phonetic sequences using professional voice actors trained in Sumerian language reconstruction to vocalize the tablet inscriptions in their proper linguistic form, simultaneously monitoring their own respiratory patterns, heart rate variability, and cerebral electrical activity through electroencephalographic equipment. Results documented in their preliminary report, submitted in 2022 to the Journal of Ancient Linguistic Analysis, revealed that vocalization of these specific tablet sequences produced measurable alterations in respiratory pattern that shifted from conscious to parasympathetic dominance within 4 minutes and 30 seconds of phonetic recitation, corresponding to the exact duration prescribed for the Ashtanga pranayama technique in Vedic documentation. Furthermore, electroencephalographic recordings demonstrated increased alpha and theta wave activity, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate regions, neurological signatures associated with meditative states and reduced cognitive filtering. Something intervened between the submission of this research and its publication. In 3012, 2 weeks after the preliminary report submission, Dr. Vestergaard received communication from the British Museum's Department of Collections Management indicating that access protocols for the Nippur tablets would be undergoing revision and that future photogrammetric documentation projects would require additional institutional approval processes with a timeline for implementation described as indefinite. Simultaneously, funding for the Northern Heritage Analysis Group, which had been supported by a consortium of private Scandinavian cultural foundations, experienced what was described in subsequent correspondence as a, quote, 47 involving those same foundations, redirecting resources toward conservation and traditional archaeological documentation projects. The preliminary research report, still held in the journal's editorial queue, was returned to the research team in June of 2022 with a letter from the journal's editor-in-chief explaining that the editorial board had encountered, quote, 48, and that future consideration would depend upon significant methodological revisions and the incorporation of, quote, 49 into the interpretive analysis. No specific objections to the methodology or data quality were articulated, only vague reference to underscore underscore quote underscore 50 underscore underscore and underscore underscore quote underscore 51 underscore underscore. What remains documented, however, exists in spaces beyond institutional gatekeeping. Vestergaard, responding to what he characterized in later interviews conducted by independent researchers as __quote _52____, chose a different pathway for knowledge dissemination. In September of 2022, preliminary findings appeared in a preprint server accessed by approximately 8,000 researchers monthly, simultaneously published through an open-access repository maintained by a private foundation based in Liechtenstein and distributed through academic networking sites beyond traditional institutional control. These documents contained data that institutional channels had effectively suppressed: high-resolution three-dimensional scans of all 42 anomalous tablets, acoustic recordings of their phonetic vocalization, electroencephalographic data from 17 separate test subjects, spectral analysis of the breathing patterns induced by their recitation, and comparative analysis correlating the induced respiratory sequences with documented pranayama protocols from 17 separate Sanskrit texts spanning a period of approximately 800 years within ancient Indian textual traditions. Geographic separation rendered this correlation particularly peculiar. Sumerian civilization, centered in the southern Mesopotamian plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, existed within a territorial radius of approximately 400 kilometers from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, occupying what modern geography recognizes as Iraq and portions of contemporary Syria and Turkey. Vedic civilization, which produced the Sanskrit texts documenting pranayama techniques, developed in the Indus Valley and subsequently expanded across the Indian subcontinent, positioned approximately 2,500 kilometers from the Mesopotamian center, with no documented trade networks, military contact, or cultural exchange during the periods when both civilizations were producing their respective textual records. Additionally, the temporal gap separating these civilizations was substantial. Sumerian written records emerged during the 4th millennium before the contemporary era, with the tablets in question dating to approximately 3,800 years before the contemporary era, or somewhat earlier depending on specific chronological frameworks.
Vedic texts, particularly those containing detailed pranayama documentation, emerged during the 2nd millennium before the contemporary era, creating a temporal separation of approximately 2,000 years minimum between the production of the Sumerian tablets and the Sanskrit documentation of breathing techniques that their phonetic structures appeared to encode. Were one to propose that one civilization had influenced the other, conventional historical mechanisms for such influence, trade networks, military conquest, migration, religious conversion, appear effectively absent from the historical record as conventionally understood. This absence of evident contact created an interpretive puzzle that functioned, for institutional researchers, as a barrier to serious consideration of Vestergaard's findings. How could encoding of breathing techniques occur in Sumerian administrative texts if no mechanism existed for transmission of Vedic knowledge to Mesopotamian scribes?
The logic appeared sound, the objection reasonable, yet it contained within itself an unstated assumption that the encoding was intentional, that Sumerian scribes understood what they were encoding, that knowledge of these breathing techniques existed within their cultural context and was deliberately woven into administrative documentation. Vestergaard's later publications, circulated through non-traditional channels beginning in 2023, proposed alternative frameworks that pushed beyond this assumption. What if, his work suggested, the encoding was not deliberate,
but rather an artifact of something deeper, a structural principle embedded within language itself, or within the phonetic organization of human communication, or within the neurological underpinnings of human consciousness that would generate similar patterns in any culture attempting to document or describe certain mental states or physiological processes. This proposition moved the discussion from institutional territories into epistemological spaces that academic disciplines had largely abandoned. If phonetic sequences could independently generate neurological effects across cultures separated by millennia and geographical distance, this suggested either that human neurology was responding to acoustic patterns according to principles currently unknown to contemporary neuroscience, or that language itself contained structural properties capable of inducing specific physiological responses independent of cultural context or intentional encoding. Neither proposition sat comfortably within frameworks that had oriented academic research for the preceding 2 centuries. Contemporary cognitive science, deeply rooted in the empiricist assumption that language is culturally arbitrary and that phonetic patterns possess no inherent physiological properties independent of learned association, found little conceptual space for research suggesting that certain phonetic sequences might generate consistent neurological effects across populations with no shared linguistic training or cultural framework. Yet the data, archived in accessible repositories beyond institutional oversight, demonstrated precisely this phenomenon across multiple repetitions and test populations. Between 2023 and 2024, 12 separate research teams operating independently, based in Romania, Argentina, Japan, Portugal, South Africa, Canada, Indonesia, Norway, Chile, Greece, Brazil, and Australia, replicated aspects of Vestergaard's methodology using clay tablets photographed from museum collections, conducting acoustic analysis and respiratory monitoring of subjects vocally performing the tablet sequences. 11 of these 12 replications reported findings substantially consistent with the original Northern Heritage Analysis Group data, identifying induced respiratory pattern shifts within similar temporal ranges, corresponding alterations in electroencephalographic signatures, and measurable cardiac variability consistent with parasympathetic nervous system activation. One replication, conducted through the University of São Paulo's Department of Anthropology, reported less dramatic findings but still documented measurable physiological responses distinct from control vocalization of standard Sumerian administrative texts from comparable chronological periods. None of these replications achieved publication through mainstream academic journals. All appeared through preprint servers, open-access repositories, or journals operating outside institutional academic structures. The suppression of this research did not occur through overt prohibition or institutional censorship of the sort that leaves documentary traces in administrative correspondence. Rather, it functioned through more subtle mechanisms. Funding redirected toward researchers proposing different questions, graduate positions allocated toward different research directions, conference presentations on these topics systematically placed in scheduling slots with minimal attendance, collaborations with institutional researchers effectively discouraged through implicit career consequences. A researcher at a prestigious American university, having contributed technical expertise to a replication study, found themselves subsequently excluded from collaborative grant proposals led by senior figures in their department. The exclusion was never formally articulated as punishment for the replication study, yet the timing and subsequent pattern of exclusion created a clear causal arrow. A graduate student in Europe who had contributed preliminary translations to one of the independent studies discovered that their thesis advisor had, without explicit discussion, begun requiring pre-approval of all collaborative work outside the primary thesis project. When the student asked directly whether the collaboration in the independent study had prompted this policy change, the advisor responded with statements regarding "*53*, and "*54*, never acknowledging the collaboration directly, yet making its status abundantly clear through administrative procedure. What remained across 2024 and into 2025 was a bifurcated research landscape. Institutional research proceeding along conventional Sumerian linguistic and historical pathways, utilizing traditional methodologies and publishing through established journals that maintained rigorous barriers against anomalous findings. And independent research, networked through digital channels largely beyond institutional monitoring, documenting phenomena that contradicted established frameworks, yet generating data that could not be entirely dismissed as artifact or methodological error because of its consistency across independent replications and the technical competence of the researchers involved. Museums continued restricting access to relevant tablet collections to researchers proposing conventionally oriented research questions. Simultaneously, high-resolution photogrammetric documentation of tablet surfaces captured before such restrictions intensified remained available through digital repositories accessible without institutional gatekeeping. The Sumerian tablets themselves, ancient clay impressed with wedge-shaped marks over 3,700 years ago, continued their silent documentation of something that contemporary academic institutions remained effectively unable to discuss within their official channels. The question that emerged from this suppression itself became data. Why would institutional mechanisms activate to restrict discussion of phonetic patterns, respiratory physiology, and electroencephalographic correlations unless something about the findings threatened established frameworks in a manner that required active suppression? Academic disputes typically resolve through debate, through presentation of alternative interpretations, through publication of critical responses that pick apart methodologies and propose competing explanations. The absence of such publication, the silence rather than the scholarly argument, created its own eloquence. If the findings were simply incorrect, erroneous methodology, or faulty data interpretation, institutional response would typically involve scholarly refutation, technical papers identifying specific errors, methodological critiques that could be published and debated. Instead, the response was redirection of funding, alteration of access protocols, and subtle career consequences for researchers pursuing the investigations. This pattern itself suggested that the findings were not considered incorrect, but rather dangerous. Dangerous to something about existing institutional frameworks, to something about established chronologies and understood historical narratives, to something about the nature of knowledge itself and who possessed the authority to define it. Deeper examination of the tablet texts undertaken by Vestergaard and his team in 2024 and archived in a preprint repository established by a private foundation in Estonia proposed that the encoding pattern appeared systematically across administrative texts from Nippur but was substantially absent from comparable tablets from other Sumerian cities including Uruk, Lagash, and Ur.
creating a geographic specificity that enhanced rather than diminished the puzzle's strangeness. If the encoding represented a universal property of Sumerian language or a structural feature of human phonetic organization, one would expect its appearance across all documented Sumerian texts. Instead, its concentration in Nippur texts from specific chronological ranges, primarily between 3,800 and 3,600 years before the contemporary era, suggested either that Nippur scribes possessed knowledge or techniques absent in other Sumerian centers, or that something specific to Nippur's institutional structure, religious practices, or cultural context during this period generated the encoding pattern. Nippur was historically the religious center of Sumerian civilization, home to the Enlil temple, the deity considered supreme in the Sumerian pantheon, and functioned as a ceremonial and administrative hub throughout Sumerian history. Could specific religious practices, meditative techniques, or spiritual disciplines pursued within Nippur's religious institutions have generated a cultural context in which breathing pattern encoding would emerge in administrative texts?
Sumerian religious documentation, limited as it is and filtered through later Akkadian and Babylonian reinterpretations, contains remarkably little explicit information about contemplative or meditative practices within the Enlil temple. Priestly functions documented in surviving texts involve ritual performance, astronomical observation, administrative functions, and maintenance of temple properties, conventional religious duties. Yet the absence of documented meditative practices does not constitute evidence for their non-existence. Many spiritual disciplines leave minimal documentary traces, particularly if they were considered internal knowledge restricted to initiated practitioners. Ancient religious institutions across multiple civilizations, Egyptian temple priesthoods, Indian Vedic schools, Mesopotamian mystery cults documented in later Hellenistic sources, maintained esoteric knowledge transmitted orally or through restricted written sources accessible only to initiated practitioners. Could Nippur's religious institution have maintained a discipline of breathing practices, perhaps learned from sources external to Sumerian civilization, or developing internally through experimentation and refinement, that subsequently influenced the phonetic organization of written texts produced within the temple's administrative systems? This possibility pushed inquiry into territories explicitly forbidden by institutional academic frameworks. Sumerian civilization was not supposed to have contact with distant cultures possessing sophisticated knowledge of physiological techniques. Mesopotamian history operated within established chronological boundaries that precluded extensive prehistorical contact or knowledge exchange with Indian civilizations. Yet if the data documented in Vestergaard's work and replicated across independent studies possessed validity, if phonetic sequences in Sumerian administrative texts genuinely did produce measurable neurological effects consistent across test populations and geographically dispersed replications, then something required explanation. Either the data was systematically false across all documented instances, a statistical impossibility of extraordinary proportions, or something about the conventional understanding of ancient Sumerian civilization, its chronology, its cultural development, its interaction with other ancient cultures, or its intellectual and spiritual traditions required fundamental revision. The tablets themselves offered no explanation. Clay compressed into rectangular form, impressed with wedge marks according to scribal convention, they documented administrative matters in language that appeared, on surface examination, entirely consistent with standard Sumerian bureaucratic notation. Only when subjected to the specific analytical frameworks Vestergaard's team had developed, isolating phonetic sequences, removing vowel markers applied by modern scholars, vocalizing according to reconstructed Sumerian pronunciation, measuring the respiratory patterns induced by such vocalization, did their hidden dimension become accessible. To an archaeologist, excavating these tablets in the conventional manner, photographing them for documentation and cataloging them according to subject matter, they appeared as ordinary administrative records. The encoding existed in a space that required specific analytical tools and interpretive frameworks to perceive. It was not hidden deliberately in a manner that would be obvious to conventional archaeological methodology, yet it was hidden nonetheless, visible only to those asking specific questions and applying specific analytical techniques.
Could such encoding have been deliberate, inscribed by Sumerian scribes who understood what they were encoding? Vestergaard's later work explored this possibility seriously, examining whether Sumerian scribal training might have included techniques for encoding information within administrative texts in a manner that would appear ordinary to conventional readers, but would yield specific phonetic patterns when vocalized. No documentary evidence supported such training, yet the absence of such evidence could simply indicate that certain knowledge was deliberately expunged from the historical record, or that such training occurred in contexts where written documentation was never created. Between 2019 and 2023, Vestergaard's team conducted what they termed the phonetic return analysis, a methodological approach that reversed their earlier work. Rather than beginning with encoded sequences and extracting meaning, they began with reconstructed Sumerian religious texts, specifically the Enuma Elish and its companion fragments preserved in the British Museum under catalogue numbers 91,401 through 91,408, and examined whether the phonetic structures embedded within these creation narratives, when subjected to specific vocal frequencies between 85 and 130 Hz, produced resonance patterns that matched architectural specifications recorded in the Nippur expedition documents of the University of Pennsylvania, conducted between 1999 and 1993. What they discovered was that certain Sumerian phonetic sequences, when vocalized at precisely calibrated frequencies, generated harmonic patterns that corresponded with the dimensions of the ziggurat at Ur, constructed during the reign of Ur-Nammu approximately 4,200 years before present time. Archaeological teams had measured the ziggurat's dimensions repeatedly since the initial excavations under Leonard Woolley in 1922 through 1934. Woolley himself recorded the primary platform as measuring approximately 210 meters in length, 141 meters in width, and rising to an original height estimated between 21 and 30 meters. Yet the internal architecture of the ziggurat contained chambers whose precise dimensions had never been satisfactorily explained within conventional Sumerian architectural theory. 3 chambers located at the southeastern corner of the first platform possessed acoustic properties that appeared deliberately engineered. Vestergaard's acoustic analysis demonstrated that when specific Sumerian phonetic sequences were vocalized within these chambers at frequencies between 92 and 115 Hz, standing wave patterns emerged that could be measured with contemporary acoustic instrumentation. These were not random resonances. Frequency analysis conducted by Dr. Marcus Halloway of the Cambridge Acoustics Laboratory in 2020
revealed that the chamber dimensions created harmonic nodes at precisely the frequencies that appeared embedded within the phonetic structure of Sumerian religious texts dating to approximately the 21st century before the Common Era. Halloway's research, submitted for publication in the Journal of Ancient Acoustics in October 2020, was withdrawn before peer review. The published reason cited was that ___quote ___quote __6___. Unpublished correspondence between Halloway and the journal's editor, Dr. Sarah Chen, released through Freedom of Information requests filed by independent researchers in 2021, revealed a different concern. Chen wrote to Halloway on October 23, 2020. The implications of your work extend beyond acoustics into domains that certain institutional bodies prefer to remain undocumented. The data is sound, the methodology is rigorous, but the conclusions that Sumerian religious texts contain encoded architectural specifications, that these specifications demonstrate knowledge of harmonic resonance principles that should not have existed in the third millennium before the Common Era, these conclusions create complications. The letter contained no specification of which institutional bodies Chen referenced, nor what specific complications concerned them. Correspondence ceased between Halloway and the journal after this exchange, and no subsequent publications on the topic appeared under either researcher's name. Between Halloway's withdrawal of his research and the present moment, spanning approximately 4 years, no peer-reviewed investigation of the acoustic properties of Sumerian temple architecture has been published in English-language academic journals. This absence itself becomes significant. At the same time, several independent researchers working outside conventional academic frameworks began conducting their own measurements. In 2022, a team led by Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo Metropolitan University, operating under a private grant from the Akira Foundation with funding of $800,000, conducted a comprehensive remeasurement of the ziggurat chambers using three-dimensional acoustic mapping technology not previously applied to ancient structures. Tanaka's team used 27 microphone arrays positioned throughout the 3 southeastern chambers, recording acoustic responses over a period of 63 days during the summer months when temperature stability allowed for consistent measurement conditions. Their data was never published in academic form. Instead, it appeared as a restricted access database accessible only to individuals who could demonstrate institutional affiliation with organizations that had signed confidentiality agreements with the Akira Foundation. The database contained 3 terabytes of acoustic measurements, frequency analyses, and harmonic mapping data. Public access to this database has been denied on the grounds of __quote _60__. When pressed by researchers who had obtained partial data through alternative channels, Foundation representatives provided a statement in 2023 indicating that the research __quote _61__. The statement did not specify what questions had been raised, nor what timeline might apply to __quote _62__. What Tanaka's data actually demonstrated, according to individuals who had access to portions of the restricted database and who chose to discuss their findings anonymously, was that the harmonic resonance patterns within the ziggurat chambers were not naturally occurring acoustic phenomena. Specific chambers had been deliberately modified. Walls had been constructed with internal cavities.
Floor materials had been selected for particular acoustic properties, and structural elements had been positioned to create nodes at frequencies that matched, with precision exceeding 98.3% correlation, the phonetic patterns embedded within cuneiform texts describing the descent of the Anunnaki from the heavens to the earthly realm. The margins of error in the correlation were smaller than could be explained by coincidence or by the application of trial-and-error architectural experimentation.
The precision suggested either advanced mathematical knowledge applied retroactively to justify existing structures, or deliberate encoding of specific acoustic principles into the temple architecture at the moment of its construction. Between 2100 and 2200 years before the Common Era, when the ziggurat at Ur was constructed, the tools available to Sumerian builders consisted of stone, copper, bronze, wood, and clay. No evidence exists of any technological apparatus that would have allowed them to calculate harmonic frequencies with the precision that Tanaka's measurements suggested. Contemporary Sumerian mathematics was sophisticated, employing base 60 numerical systems and demonstrating knowledge of geometric principles. But mathematical frameworks that would allow calculation of acoustic resonance patterns at frequencies measured in hertz did not emerge in human civilization until the 19th century of the Common Era, when researchers like Ernst Florenz Friedrich Chladni began conducting systematic investigations of acoustic vibration in 2000 and 1786. The technological gap between the mathematical knowledge available in the 21st century before the Common Era and the precision of acoustic engineering evident in the ziggurat chambers represents a discontinuity in the historical record of technological development. This discontinuity has four possible explanations, none of which has achieved consensus among researchers, and all of which remain subject to significant interpretive dispute. The first explanation, and the one preferred by conventional archaeology, proposes that the acoustic correlations discovered by Holloway and Tanaka represent coincidental alignments between phonetic patterns and structural dimensions. According to this interpretation, Sumerian priests developed religious texts over centuries. The phonetic patterns of these texts were refined and modified through oral transmission until they achieved aesthetic and mnemonic qualities that felt harmonious when vocalized, and these same aesthetic properties happened to correlate with the structural dimensions of buildings that Sumerian architects designed according to entirely different principles based on cultural preferences for proportion, symmetry, and aesthetic balance. Under this interpretation, the correlation between phonetic patterns and acoustic properties is mathematically inevitable rather than deliberately engineered. When any complex system of sound-generating patterns is compared to any complex system of physical dimensions, certain correlations will emerge simply through probability. This explanation requires acceptance of correlation coefficients exceeding 98% between unrelated design processes as the result of chance. The statistical likelihood of such correlation occurring through random design processes, according to analyses conducted by independent statisticians, falls below 1 in 4 billion. Yet the conventional archaeological interpretation maintains that even this extraordinarily improbable coincidence should be accepted as more plausible than any alternative hypothesis. The second explanation, advanced by researchers who question conventional archaeological frameworks but remain committed to materialist explanations, proposes that the Sumerian builders possessed mathematical and acoustic knowledge derived from sources that left no written documentation. According to this interpretation, advanced mathematical principles were transmitted orally through priestly orders.
And these principles were applied to architectural design with deliberate intention to create structures with specific acoustic properties. Sumerian priests understood harmonic resonance through empirical observation. They may have discovered that specific arrangements of materials and spaces produced satisfying acoustic effects. They may have developed systematic methods for testing and refining these arrangements, and they may have progressively accumulated knowledge that, while not formalized in the mathematical language that would later emerge in 19th century Europe, nonetheless represented sophisticated understanding of acoustic principles. Under this interpretation, the correlation between phonetic patterns and architectural dimensions reflects deliberate encoding of acoustic knowledge into both language and structure. This explanation requires positing a form of pre-mathematical science, knowledge of principles and relationships expressed through practical application rather than formal mathematical notation that exceeded anything conventional archaeology has previously attributed to ancient civilizations. Some researchers cite parallel examples. The ancient Egyptians' understanding of geometry applied to pyramid construction, the sophisticated astronomical knowledge embedded in Mayan calendrical systems, the advanced metallurgical knowledge evident in Damascus steel production. In each case, cultures developed sophisticated technological knowledge without necessarily formalizing it in written mathematical frameworks. Yet for acoustic engineering, a field requiring measurement precision in the range of single Hertz frequencies, such empirical knowledge accumulation seems to exceed the capabilities of observation-based science without instrumentation. The third explanation, advanced primarily by researchers operating outside conventional academic institutions and publishing primarily through independent channels, proposes that the acoustic engineering evident in the ziggurat chambers and the phonetic encoding in Sumerian texts reflect transmission of knowledge from non-human sources. According to this interpretation, the Anunnaki, described in Sumerian texts as beings who descended from the heavens, possessed technological knowledge that they deliberately transmitted to human priests and builders. The acoustic properties of the ziggurat chambers represent applied knowledge of harmonic resonance principles, and the phonetic patterns embedded in religious texts represent either direct transcription of information provided by these non-human sources or symbolic encoding of technological principles that human priests understood intellectually but could not express in the mathematical language available to them. Under this interpretation, the precision of correlation between phonetic patterns and acoustic properties reflects the intentionality of beings with advanced technological knowledge deliberately designing both linguistic and architectural systems to encode specific principles. Researchers advancing this explanation note that numerous Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as those who know, the wise ones, and those who possess knowledge of the heavens and the earth. According to this interpretation, these descriptions reflect accurate documentation of encounters with beings possessing superior technological knowledge, and the acoustic engineering evident in the ziggurat represents one of several technological gifts transmitted from these beings to human civilization. The fourth explanation, advanced by a small number of researchers and subject to significant controversy even among those skeptical of conventional archaeological frameworks, proposes that the acoustic engineering evident in the ziggurat chambers and the phonetic encoding in Sumerian texts reflect evidence of temporal causality violations. According to this interpretation, knowledge of acoustic principles developed in 19th century Europe was somehow transmitted backward through time to Sumerian priests and builders. This explanation emerges from certain interpretations of quantum mechanics and theories of nonlinear temporal causality, and it remains highly speculative. Yet proponents note that the precision of correlation between phonetic patterns and acoustic properties is so extraordinary that conventional forward-time causality seems inadequate to explain it. If knowledge traveled backward through time, it would explain how Sumerian builders possessed mathematical and acoustic knowledge that should not have existed in their era. Researchers advancing this explanation are careful to note that they do not claim to understand the mechanism by which such backward temporal transmission might occur, nor do they claim that contemporary evidence supports such a mechanism. Rather, they argue that when conventional explanations are evaluated against the actual data recovered by Holloway and Tanaka, backward temporal transmission becomes one of several interpretations that cannot be entirely dismissed. Each of these four explanations faces significant logical difficulties. Coincidence alone seems statistically implausible to the point of logical absurdity. Empirical accumulation of acoustic knowledge without instrumentation exceeds documented capabilities of ancient observation-based science. Transmission of knowledge from non-human sources introduces entities for which contemporary evidence is limited to textual references and requires acceptance of interpretations of ancient texts that mainstream scholarship rejects. Backward temporal transmission violates fundamental assumptions about the directionality of causality and remains incompatible with contemporary physics, despite certain speculative theoretical frameworks that suggest it might not be entirely impossible. Yet one of these four explanations, or some combination thereof, must be true. The acoustic data recovered by Holloway and Tanaka is authentic. The correlation between phonetic patterns and architectural dimensions is demonstrable and reproducible. The precision of this correlation far exceeds what coincidence alone could explain. Therefore, some mechanism must account for this precision. Between 2023 and 2024, researchers working with restricted access to Tanaka's database began reporting, through anonymous channels and private communications, additional findings that suggested the acoustic phenomena within the ziggurat chambers possessed properties that exceeded conventional acoustic theory. According to these reports, when specific phonetic sequences from Sumerian religious texts were vocalized within the southeastern chambers at particular frequencies, measurement instruments registered responses that appeared inconsistent with the known properties of sound waves. Standing wave patterns within the chambers seemed to persist longer than acoustic principles would predict. Energy levels associated with harmonic resonance appeared to exceed the energy input from vocalization, suggesting some form of resonance amplification or external energy source. These reports were never formally published, and their accuracy cannot be independently verified. Yet the consistency of these reports across multiple independent observers, the specificity of the technical measurements they described, and the apparent reluctance of institutional bodies to permit public investigation of these phenomena suggest that something significant may be occurring within the ziggurat chambers, something that conventional acoustic theory cannot adequately explain, and something that certain organizations have decided should remain subject to restricted access and confidentiality agreements. In 2024, the Iraqi government, under pressure from international heritage organizations and UNESCO, announced plans to conduct comprehensive restoration of the ziggurat at Ur. This restoration project was to include structural reinforcement, documentation of interior chambers, and installation of climate control systems designed to prevent further deterioration. Announcement of the restoration project triggered immediate response from multiple sources. The Akira Foundation submitted a formal request to the Iraqi Ministry of Culture requesting that certain interior chambers be excluded from restoration work and that access to these chambers be restricted to authorized researchers operating under Foundation-approved protocols. The Foundation's request did not specify which chambers required restricted access, nor did it explain the rationale for such restrictions. The Iraqi Ministry of Culture initially rejected the Foundation's request, asserting that all restoration work would be conducted transparently with international oversight. However, within 3 weeks of this rejection, the Ministry of Culture issued a revised statement indicating that restoration work would proceed according to, quote, 67, and that, quote, 68 would be subject to, quote, 69. The revised statement contained no specification of which areas were, quote, 70, nor what timeline might apply to, quote, 71. Quote followed was a period of approximately 6 months during which restoration work proceeded, but international media access to the ziggurat was progressively restricted. In January 2024, journalists and independent researchers could access the site with standard permits. By March 2024, access was restricted to individuals with specific credentials issued by the Ministry of Culture. By June 2024, the ziggurat site was closed entirely to unauthorized personnel, and a perimeter fence was erected surrounding the structure with posted warnings in Arabic and English prohibiting unauthorized entry. Within this restricted zone, construction activity was documented by satellite imagery, but no on-site reports from independent observers emerged. The construction activity visible in satellite imagery suggested that interior modifications were occurring. Thermal signatures indicated equipment installation in areas beneath the primary platform, and structural modifications appeared to involve reinforcement or alteration of the southeastern chambers that had been the focus of Holloway's and Tanaka's earlier acoustic research. Between June and October 2024, the ziggurat site remained closed to public access. During this period, 17 independent researchers attempted to gain access to the site for documentation purposes. All requests were denied by the Iraqi Ministry of Culture. 3 researchers who attempted unauthorized entry were detained by security personnel, questioned by Iraqi intelligence officials, and subsequently released with warnings not to return to the site. These individuals reported, in subsequent interviews conducted by independent journalists, that the security personnel they encountered appeared to be operating under protocols that exceeded standard archaeological site protection. Military-grade equipment was present at the site. Personnel were armed with weapons appropriate to military rather than civilian security operations. Interrogation procedures suggested that the authorities were investigating not merely unauthorized archaeological access, but potential espionage. When asked what information the security personnel sought, the detained researchers reported being questioned extensively about their communications with other researchers, their funding sources, and their specific interest in the acoustic properties of the ziggurat chambers. This line of questioning suggested that authorities understood the significance of the acoustic research